Thank you, Ivan, for inviting me, for giving me the challenge to summarize everything that has to be summarized in PTSD in 15 minutes. It's just impossible. Instead, and in the spirit of the today's venue, I'm going to focus on gaps that are might be leading to innovation or require innovations. And the entire talk is going to be a series of teasers, because I will never have the time to get in depth into any of the topics. A teaser as to what the issues are within the PTSD arena, PTSD itself, detection, prevention, and treatment that require further invention. PTSD itself, I'll go through the definition and the natural course and focus on the gaps and the challenges. You'll see that there's no point wasting time on this slide. So to summarize what PTSD is, there are many, many, many ways to look at it, is the continuation and expansion of trauma-triggered cognitive, emotional, and physiological responses despite trauma termination. You can look into the DSM. You'll hear about it in a second, 20-odd markers. But that's really what it is. And the typical symptoms are the persistence of responses to reminders, alteration of moods and cognition, a pervasive sense of imminent threat. I'll relate to that, like a predictive modification of one's predictive immediate future, disturbed sleep and hypervigilance. In terms of natural course for today, I want just to emphasize the fact that many individuals express PTSD symptoms, maybe the full PTSD symptoms. You can see here for rape survivors in the lower cortex, 24% of them, well, you may want to see that, 24% of rape survivors express the full syndrome of PTSD 1 week after trauma. Think about the ANOVA rescue. And then with time, the number of those expressed PTSD declines, but the point is that it might be very difficult to identify among the 24% the ones who are likely to remain with chronic psychopathology. That's what I want us to retain from this brief view of the natural course of PTSD. The gaps? Well, the gaps, first of all, there are varying descriptions. In my short or long, whatever, professional life, I've been through 5 or 6 definitions of PTSD. Modified at the time is really a moving target. What is really interesting is that between the DSM-4 and DSM-5 and the ICD, last 2-3, the overlap between samples identified by each of the 3, between DSM-4 and DSM-5, overlap is 55%, meaning there are 45% of individuals who would be diagnosed by one, but not by the other system. And if you combine the two, only 35 co-occurring. So we have a problem with a phenotype. Better ways to look at those problems with this phenotype is one of my pupils, Isaac Gallagher-Levy and Rich Bryant, looked at the DSM-5 20 syndrome, and they found there are 600,000, 36 and odd ways to have post-traumatic stress disorder, meaning there are so many permutations of these indicating symptoms that would still qualify for PTSD. This is specifically true for PTSD. If you look at depression, major depression, there are only 225 permutations. It's kind of critical of what it is, but what it actually tells us is that symptoms, whatever they are not the disorder itself. They are, at best, they are pointers to an underlying entity, which is PTSD. PTSD is not what you see in the DSM. Another way to look at this phenotype heterogeneity, PTSD is never alone. This is cutting through a population 4 months after a traumatic event. There are 37 individuals with PTSD. Most of them have either major depression or anxiety disorder or both. So comorbidity is really, now from a biological perspective, from a therapeutic perspective, are these subgroups different or are they the same? We don't really know that much. So those are the difficulties, something calling for change. The other gap is the complexity. Everyone talks about the complexity. So let me illustrate the complexity by this slide. This is actually a graph looking at relationship between a rather large number of predictive features of PTSD collected at Hadassah ED in a study designed to look at cortisol and the relationship cortisol involving PTSD. You can see that there are any number of would-be predictors or risk factors, and there's a network of association. Just to make it a bit clearer, you can see what we mean by this. Impact is a site taken at the emergency room. There's a cortisol in the emergency room, heart rate in the emergency room, anxiety in the emergency room. So this is the complexity. This is as far as the complexity of PTSD etiology goes. And there's one thing I want to look at is the direct relationship between ER, emergency room cortisol, and the long non-remitting trajectory of PTSD. We'll get back to it in a minute. But even also, if you want to look at the involvement of brain systems in PTSD, you can see that there are several interacting neural circuits putting all this malfunction. Emotional regulation, threat saliency detection, context processing, which is extremely interesting. This is why PTSD patients fail to process the safety signal that they get from their environment. They are back in a safe environment, but they don't behave as if they were, and fear learning. So many interacting systems. Again, this is extremely complex, and so what are the challenges? The challenge is, one of them, is to find subsets that will be more homogeneous in that. So I'll take you back to this huge network, and within it, we could identify by a causal vector technology a subset, a local network that pertains mainly to the emergency room and the environment. And as we zip through it, we can see that in that particular study, if you had childhood trauma here and you had lower emergency room cortisol, that was causally directly connected to a non-remitting. If you didn't have a child trauma, then you went through a series of predictors at different time moments. So, however, there were only 11% of individuals with childhood trauma in the sample, and the original study was a negative study because we didn't find differences in cortisol. So that is, as soon as you identify subset, you might be able to act accordingly. The other challenge, not less important, is to move away from symptom definition and trying to affect symptoms and consider PTSD, the non-remitting PTSD, the very difficult, as a stable, new stable equilibrium at the CNS, and then think about what might be the factors that keep this equilibrium stable, such that the disorder doesn't change with time. Is that a predictor bias, the fact that I'm predicting that the next thing that's going to happen is something is going to explode around the door and my attention is focusing to that? Is that the forbidding alarm system? Once I'm triggered, the alarm system is so forbidding that I'm trying to. So there are many processes, and we don't really systematically relate to each of them as a target for therapeutic. There's no way to do therapeutic for the whole syndrome. We try to uncover those factors that are not really related to the etiology of PTSD. Most therapies go back to the etiology, CBT and others, and just look at what is the factor that makes PTSD chronic. Moving from the syndrome to detection, I would say just a few things. Symptom severity is the best indicator currently. Nothing else. Everything that some put within it any biological or other factors. No biomarkers add to the predictions made by early symptoms, unfortunately. Now, this is the what you saw before. This is the 97% rape victims. You can see that the symptoms, the high symptoms, and eventually, how can you use symptoms to predict PTSD? Well, let me show you. This is a large group, more than 2,400 subjects from 7 emergency rooms in Europe, in Japan, and other in a study we did. And in the histogram, you can see the distribution of PTSD symptom severity. Here is the CAPS severity. This is the rating scale from 1 to 120. The distribution of cases based on their severity. You can see that most individuals don't express PTSD symptoms, exactly as I said before. But if you look at the distribution of those who develop PTSD here in red among the cohort, they come from all over. Some people develop PTSD with lower level of symptoms, others with higher level of symptoms, which gives us an opportunity because the likelihood of expressing PTSD with the low symptoms is much lower, which takes us to this. You can plot this on a logistic fit and have a good predictor of PTSD. You could use that to predict PTSD. We published that a couple of years ago, such that if you have an initial CAP score of 42, just the capsule, you have 30.2% likelihood of developing PTSD. Now, if you have a other vulnerability factor or protective factor, if you're male, educated, and with no prior trauma, your likelihood of developing PTSD with the same score is 7.8%. And if you're a female, less than high school, and with prior trauma, it jumps to 26%. The generic point is that every single predictor, every single risk factor depends on the context. There is no way to understand or to predict on a single factor because they're all context dependent. Look at the symptoms. Okay. Detection challenges. I'm probably going to finish on that, is we need, obviously, computational models that match the kind of etiologic complexity. But we did one thing. Since we're in Israel, this is what we did. We can still use symptoms, early symptoms, to predict PTSD. This is an application that is now running. You can get to it with this HTTP israelptsd.com. Individual, iPhone-based, that allows every individual to compute and get a feedback on the likelihood of him or her developing PTSD and referring to treatment. So this is how it starts. This is the algorithm. You see, on the one hand, some short rating scale. If you're positive on those, you go to longer rating scale, and then you get a feedback outcome. So the feedback outcome, you can see that the results of the questionnaires, and on some questionnaire, this particular individual is above in the red, above the threshold of disease likelihood, and there is a conclusion, and a person gets a recommendation. You can get a PDF and refer yourself to treatment, and this is now available for everyone on an iPhone. We tried it on about more than 600 reservists just upon being released from Gaza. This is 2 weeks ago, and the completion rate is 77.8%. You can see them filling the questionnaire, and we already know a couple of things about these cohorts that we wouldn't have known otherwise. So I will skip the prevention issue because I don't have time. Is that true? And go directly to one thing that I wanted to share with you, is the prevalence estimate of PTSD in Israel, which is important. There is a debate around that. We just a paper was just published, predicting that more than 500,000 Israelis will develop PTSD, not yet peer-reviewed. And I'm not sure that this is correct. in the recommendations that we gave to the Ministry of Health as, triggers my PTSD. You cannot predict from a population. This is hopeless. The graph here, which is now coming, is trying to predict in New York who will have PTSD after the 9/11, 7% initially, and then it goes to 0.6% a year, less than a year later. You can't do that. So you can only predict on the basis of those who develop initial symptoms, and we believe that the literature gets us into assuming that about 30 to 40% of individuals who are eligible for diagnosis of PTSD early on might be developing PTSD. We don't know the denominator, but it's probably much, much lower than 500,000 people with PTSD, and we're talking about chronic PTSD. That's it all I'm allowed to give you now, and thank you for your attention.